Hello. Good afternoon. Thank you for your good afternoon. Thank you for your patience. We're having a few technical difficulties, but we're now ready to get started. So I'm Christopher Herbert. I'm the Managing Director of the Joint Center for Housing Studies, and I'm very pleased to welcome you to the evolving landscape of social housing in New England. To begin with, we have a few housekeeping announcements. First, that there is live captioning available online. So you can use this QR code to click it. And if you are listening at home, you can contact the folks in the booth to get help if the closed captioning is not working. I also want to announce a couple of upcoming events. We have on April 23rd, the lecture, These Contradictory Things by Max Bond's Harvard by Brian Goldstein. And then on April 24th, there's a book release, Thinking Through Soil. So I think that's the end of our public service announcements. And so now I get to help explain why it is we're here today and what it is we're talking about. So we're here today to talk about the evolving landscape of social housing in New England. I'm just waiting. Woo! And I would say the motivation for this event is and you're all here, so I'm kind of preaching to the choir, but you don't even have to be paying much attention to housing to notice that over the last few years, it seems like there has been one study after another calling for social housing in the U.S. You know, and as I'm teaching a class this semester on this topic as well, and as I was preparing for over this fall, it seemed like every week somebody was sending me, there's a new report, there's a new report, there's a new proposal. And so this is something that's been percolating furiously. And so we at the Joint Center, we wanted to take time to take stock of this and assess this movement. And the first question I think we have to ask ourselves is, why? Why is it that suddenly social housing is appearing every other day in some report? And there's a few obvious reasons for it. One is that, renters are facing a record level of unaffordability. This chart is showing you how many renters are facing cost burdens over time. And you can see how it's been rising since the beginning of the decade. And then with the pandemic, there was a further spike in it. And so in some respects, we can say, well, it's about the fact that over the last couple of years, we've been seeing renter cost burdens increase. But to some extent, that's been true for a long time. One big difference, I think, is that we look at the pattern of who is affected by cost burdens. This is showing you the share of renters by income bands. And look at those in the middle. People making $30,000 to $45,000 and even $45,000 to $75,000 a year are the group that has started to see the biggest increase in cost burdens. So one of the biggest differences over the last 20 years is not that low-income people are struggling to pay rent. They've been struggling for a long time. But now it's people who are working year-round, full-time at decent jobs. And that's given rise to the YIMBY movement in California. And it's given rise to a broader coalition of people who are saying, what gives when it comes to rental housing? The other piece of this story, though, is that, as I alluded to, this is not a new story. So if we look at going back to 1960, the share of renters who are cost burdened. In 1960, it was about a quarter of renters. By 1980, it's 35% of renters. By 2000, it's about 39% of renters, and then it gets to 50% of renters. So as much as we have headlines today saying, suddenly, rental housing's in an affordability crisis, this crisis has been brewing for half a century. And why is that? Why is it that people can't afford housing? And there's a really basic, fundamental, cruel math, which if you look at that top line, what has happened, and this is inflation adjusted, to the cost of rent going back to 1960, it's up 73%. If you look at what's happened to renters' incomes, it's only up 14%. So I ask you, do we have a housing cost problem or an income problem? Yes. Who said that? That's the answer. The answer is yes. We have an income problem, and we have to think about how we solve that. But we have a real housing cost problem. Now, why do we have a housing cost problem? So this next chart's a little complicated, so bear with me. But there are three components to the cost of a home. There's what does it cost to build that house? There's how big and how nice a quality is that house? And how expensive is the piece of land that house sits on? They've all gone up. But we look here, the bottom line there, the lowest line, is the cost of construction. These are not adjusted for inflation, by the way. So that's gone up by almost a factor of 4 going back to 1975. The kind of quality and size of the house has driven up costs by a factor of 6. But the cost of land has driven up prices by a factor of 15. And so if you think about why is my house in Lexington, Mass. tripled in value, it's not because that 1913 colonial is such a gem. It's because the piece of land it sits on has tripled in value over time. And so when people talk about decommodifying housing, what they're talking about is the fact that that land that it's sitting on is appreciating in value with nothing necessarily being done to it just because of its value. So we're here today talking about social housing because affordability has worsened. It's worsened for a long time, and it's worsened for more and more people, not just the poor. Okay, so that's why we're talking about social housing, but what the heck is social housing? And there's no definition of one definition of social housing, and we could have had a whole symposium to discuss that. Maybe we should. But I'll offer a few thoughts on that. And I would say is that the common denominator for social housing, it is housing that's permanently affordable. So this is housing that's taken off the market. It's not subject to market forces. It has a steward who is managing that housing to pay for its costs, but not to respond to market pressures. Many times that means it's interpreted to be owned by the public sector. And that's a part a lot of the proposals we'll see, but I would say it doesn't have to be. It just has to be managed to be permanently affordable. The other piece of that permanent affordability is it kind of leaves open, well, what do we mean by affordable and affordable for whom? And I think there's a lot of variation there in terms of who we're talking about. But in essence, most of these proposals for social housing are not relying on subsidies per se, as operating subsidies. They may require upfront subsidies, but it's really how the housing is managed and operated over time. The second thing, and I would say this is now how often, not always, often it elevates resident and community control. And so this is the notion that this housing, in order to be operated and managed for the purpose of providing good, decent quality housing, has to have an important role for residents in the community in that housing. The second, I would say, is that it often emphasizes socioeconomic and racial inclusion. This is about housing that's not just for poor folks, and it's not for the kind of housing we've had in the past that's tend to segregate people by color and by race, but it's housing that's more broadly inclusive. And again, sometimes, not always, this is an element. And then lastly, sometimes but not always, there's a piece of this that has to do with goals of creating green and sustainable housing and goals of having fair labor be producing that housing. So but I would say the common denominator is permanent affordability, and these other elements are part of the conversation. All right, so I've talked about why, I've talked about these proposals. The other thing that's important is that this is not just something that is theoretical. It's something that's happening. Montgomery County, Atlanta, Chicago, Seattle, Chattanooga. All of these places are embracing new forms of delivering affordable housing with a strong public engagement in that process. So with that, we wanted to have this event. We wanted to have this event to have a conversation within the community of Harvard, the broader community, about this social housing movement. We called it the evolving landscape of social housing in New England for a reason. And for that, I want to turn to my colleague, Susanne Schindler at the Joint Center. Susanne and I, along with David Luberoff and Zach Davidson, Dust student from MIT, pulled this concept of this conference together. So I want to bring up Susanne to say, why is this the evolving landscape of social housing in New England?
Hi, everyone. I'm Susanne. Can you hear me? Yes, I see. So how do I... Oh, there we go. All right, so here we are. How do I operate this? Oh, there's a green button. Excellent. I found the green button. So the evolving landscape. Right here in New England, social housing may seem like a new movement with a new approach to address our housing challenges, but there are many ways in which the movement key goals have already been evident in existing organizations' work, especially here in New England. This is why we titled the event An Evolving Landscape. We wanted to bring together newcomers and old-timers, activists and bureaucrats, architects and underwriters. We wanted to have the voices from across the 6 New England states, from urban, small town, and rural areas, come together. And we're happy to have accomplished this. We have at least one representative from each of the 6 states, even if we acknowledge there's a slight imbalance in the Boston area. To bring these voices into conversation with each other, we've structured the afternoon in 3 panels, each dedicated to one key demand of the social housing movement. The first we've titled Enabling Public Development, or bringing back a leading role for the public sector in planning, developing, funding, and owning housing. The second panel is dedicated to the theme of empowering residents, or giving those who live in the housing a stronger role in designing, operating, and stewarding these properties over time. And finally, the last panel is dedicated to expanding financial supports, or moving beyond tax credits and vouchers, the current system's two main instruments, since those two simply do not provide enough funding relative to the need. These two instruments also fund only a limited spectrum of renters and a certain type of housing. The past looms large in this search for a different future, and US housing history has largely been a two-tiered system, in the words of historian Gail Radford, divided by income and race. Single-family private home ownership on this one side for some, exemplified by Levittown, and multifamily public rental on the other, exemplified by Pruitt-Igoe. Apologies for taking the two most cliched examples in the playbook. But protagonists of the current social housing movement aim to move beyond this dichotomy. In doing so, they often point to a slightly earlier moment in history where a more inclusive vision of social housing was possible, exemplified by the Carl Mackley houses in Philadelphia, a mid-rise nonprofit development sponsored by a labor union which featured general shared amenities, including a pool. This past shapes some of the recurring questions that we'll address throughout the afternoon and that Chris already alluded to. The first one is a matter of scale, or how to get innovative and pragmatic efforts to the scale needed relative to the need. Eligibility, or the question of who social housing is for. Is it just for the poorest, or should it serve a broader swath of the population? The tricky question of wealth building and what that means, or the question of whether social housing should allow residents to benefit individually from an appreciating asset. And finally, the question of design, or how to create places that respond to households' needs and desires and that will last over time. In trying to answer these questions, it often seems that we're stuck in that conceptual dichotomy of the 20th century, as recent coverage on housing in the New York Times might suggest. Or at least that is what I think when I see the case being made for suburban subdivisions where the houses are so tightly packed, there isn't much you can actually do in that private backyard. Contrast that with a rooftop pool, co-owned in a co-owned nonprofit high-rise in Vienna. Again, I apologize for referring to examples outside of the US, but these are part of the conversation right now. And this project will come up again and again. And this shared luxury of this pool is possible only because there's a different shared conception of investment, governance, and design. And I would argue that this is what is social about social housing, the luxury of a pool that's big enough to actually swim in. So in other words, you get more and not less when you think of housing as an endeavor that we're all tied up in together. I want to suggest 3 ways to think about the opportunity that the social housing conversation presents for everyone. Social housing to me is about ensuring the longevity of public investment. This is not about just correcting a market failure. Social housing is about creating housing that is self-sustaining financially, so it will serve not just the current residents, but future generations. I think it's also about bringing prices down for everyone. It's not just for the residents. Again, I want to stress this point. This is a broader conversation. Employers can pay lower wages if housing costs less. Consumers can spend more if their income isn't all tied up in housing. Health outcomes are better when people aren't isolated in their homes. So social housing is not charity or welfare. It is an investment that creates returns for all. Finally, it's about designing places where we can learn to live together again. This is not about building more of the same. Again, this is my point of view, so disclaimer, maybe I'm not talking for the institution or for any institution, it's just me. So, social housing provides an opportunity to explore forms of housing that the market does not provide. Why does it not provide it? Because lenders and insurers cannot assess the risk of something that does not already exist. So, social housing is an opportunity to figure out how to create a shared reality for an increasingly polarized country. Creating opportunity is a matter of politics. and political majorities are negotiated in part through dollar amounts and lines of text in bills, as you can see in these excerpts of 2 recent bills. In this way, Rhode Island and Massachusetts each set aside money for a social housing or public development pilot program. To form these pilot programs, how these pilot programs will take shape is currently being hashed out between those needing housing and those developing it. Visualizing what is possible is critical to turning this political opportunity into actual change. This is where the specificity of architecture comes in, and this is why we're having this conversation in a school of design, and why involvement of a next generation of designers is so important. It's now with great pleasure to introduce to you our keynote speaker, Mike Connolly. Since 2019, Mike has represented parts of Cambridge and Somerville in the Massachusetts House. In this role, he has spearheaded social housing proposals and legislation in this state. Mike will be with us all afternoon and will join us again to close out the conversations at the end. And hopefully some of the ideas discussed today will inform the future of social housing, not just in Massachusetts. Thanks.
Well, good afternoon, everyone, and thank you, Christopher, and thank you, Suzanne, for bringing us together, and thank you for that welcome and that overview. It's such an honor to be here at the Graduate School of Design and to be a part of this event. And while we're on the topic of thanking people from Harvard, I just want to take a moment to say thank you to President Alan Gerber for standing up to Donald Trump. President Gerber said the university will not surrender its independence or relinquish its constitutional rights. Amen. I also want to recognize a few of my colleagues in government who are here: Cambridge City Councilor Jeevan Sobrino Wheeler, City Councilors Patty Nolan and Kathy Zuzzi. Thank you for joining us. So I'm going to do 3 things this afternoon. I'm going to tell you a little bit about myself. I'm going to talk to you about the work we're doing on Beacon Hill to advance this concept of social housing. As you referenced, we have an authorization to do a pilot program. And then I'm going to highlight some of the questions, the tensions, the challenges that have emerged as we've done this work. And along the way, I'm going to work to answer that question that's the charge of this speech: why social housing? So for starters, there's a little bit of background about me. I'm a lifelong renter. I live in Central Square. I was raised in public housing in Norwood, Massachusetts. There's a beautiful plaque at the top of my old street, Jefferson Drive, that says, "Built and financed by the Commonwealth of Massachusetts." And so this was state-financed, developed public housing post-World War II. And of course, you know, it was very meaningful to have that opportunity to grow up in a stable environment. As a kid, you know, I faced my share of adversity. My mom got sick for a time, and I was in foster care for a while. And so in my early years, no one would have expected anything from me. I sort of had a notorious reputation. But as you can see from my size, I'm literally a giant. And so by the time I made it to high school, I started getting attention from the coaches. I realized I was actually pretty good at school. And by age 16, I have to mention this, I was offered to come to Harvard to play football, but I took a better offer. I took a full ride to Duke University to play football, where we proceeded to lose almost every game over the next 4 years. But it was really that trajectory that I think formed the core of my political view, being, you know, in public housing one day, and then the next day being rocketed to a very elite institution and almost being a VIP as a member of the football team, when it really dawned on me that wealth inequality is just so profound. And I think, you know, as we think about this housing emergency we're in, and Chris, as you showed, you know, the divergent graph between people's incomes and the cost of housing, so much of that is tied to this unprecedented wealth and income inequality. I think you may have to go back to the Great Depression to find inequality as stark as it is right now. After college, I went to law school and graduated right during the Great Recession. And so you can imagine that really also influenced my political views. You know, I was one of those ones who accomplished all the things, did all the things, and then, you know, came right out of law school where it was hard to find a job at that moment. And so when the Occupy Wall Street movement happened, I was ready. I got involved. I became an activist, an organizer, and that's what really got me thinking about running for public office. So fast forward to 2017, I'm being sworn in on Beacon Hill as state representative for parts of Cambridge and Somerville. And, you know, what really struck me was that the Democratic leaders' housing agenda looked a lot like our Republican governor, Charlie Baker's housing agenda. The agenda, first and foremost, was zoning reform. And I support smart zoning reform, but the pieces that I felt were missing would be the need to dramatically increase public subsidy, to add financing tools, and to have strong tenant protections like rent control. Last term, I founded the Housing for All Legislative Caucus with Senator Lydia Edwards. And really the first goal of the caucus is to advance the vision of housing as a human right. And I think that's so much of what's been missing in our housing policy. I sometimes say if we did all the things that advocates and organizers were calling for on Beacon Hill, I'm not sure everyone would have affordable housing, even if we passed all the bills. And so even as we work on advancing things like social housing and a local option real estate transfer fee and rent stabilization, I think it's so important to start at the very end and say, what is it going to look like when all people have affordable housing that's stable and dignified, that there are opportunities to build wealth? And I think social housing can be such an important part of that. You know, along the way, I mentioned subsidy became a thing that I realized we just can't get enough of. And, you know, there's so many good programs, there's so many good professionals who are working the programs that are available. But just to put it in context for you, back in December of 2022, the National Association of Housing and Redevelopment Officials and some local organizations, they brought forward a proposal for universal rental vouchers. And I totally support this. It sounds like a great idea. And at the time, the state was budgeting $154 million in its voucher program. And the price tag on this proposal was $3.2 billion. And that's certainly something, you know, I call myself a tax and spend liberal, so I'm ready to do $3.2 billion. However, that's something that just wasn't feasible for the state. And so I think that brings us to the interest and the desire for social housing. And, you know, one of the things that I think is so exciting about social housing is you think of the ways that we generally spend money on housing. We have vouchers, we have tax credits, we have shelter. And in all those ways, the money goes out the door, it does a very important thing, but the money doesn't necessarily come back. And so with those voucher investments, we make the investment, it houses a family, and the money ends up in the hands of a landlord or a bank or an investor. What really excited me about the concept of social housing is the potential to create these revolving loan funds where we can have publicly financed mixed income housing with tenant control, with strong labor provisions, with sustainability provisions like net zero. And we can make investments in that housing, have a public asset, and then see that investment come back even as we have the opportunity to hold that asset over time. So I'll tell you a little bit about the work we've done to get this pilot program set up. And I want to shout out Dan Denver from Rhode Island. It was December of 2022 when I reached out to Dan, because in Rhode Island they have been moving forward with a pilot as well, and I asked Dan about what was going on. He connected me to Paul Williams at the Center for Public Enterprise, who's very involved with the Housing Opportunities Commission in Maryland. And so we started to formulate a bill, an act establishing the Massachusetts Social Housing Program. And so this legislation would capitalize a revolving fund. It would charge public entities like Mass Housing to administer the fund, and it would offer low-cost financing to local housing authorities to produce mixed-income public housing. And so around that time, Governor Healy created the Executive Office of Housing and Livable Communities. And so I reached out to Secretary Ed Augustus, and my message to him was, look, Rhode Island's doing this, they're moving forward, Montgomery County, Maryland is moving forward, and we really can't be left behind. We have to be part of it as well. We did a $5.2 billion housing bond bill last session, and so as a part of that, we were able to pitch the administration and get buy-in among my colleagues on Beacon Hill to authorize a social housing pilot program. So now, as of last month, we have initiated the Social Housing Working Group, and that's really about bringing together stakeholders. Chris and Susanne are members of it, Kenzie Bach from the Boston Housing Authority, Margaret from CHA, Crystal from Mass Housing. We're really bringing a wide range of stakeholders together to figure out, how do we take the concept and then how do we fit it into this robust landscape of different institutions that we have already doing various kinds of housing development and affordable housing development. And so, I think to kind of wrap up here, I will go through, I think, some of the questions, that have come up along the way. Certainly, one question is, what can social housing do that other programs can't do? And I'll mention, one exciting program is called the Momentum Fund, and that was another part of the Affordable Homes Act. And so that will be a revolving loan fund. So I'm very excited to see that and see the potential. But it's not clear that it necessarily includes the public ownership piece, and it's not clear that it necessarily achieves the level of affordability. Another question we have, and it's very sincere, very something I take seriously, people who are doing the good work, public housing authorities, conventional low-income housing, tax credit, affordable housing developers, there's a fear that, wait a minute, if this social housing thing is the new trend, are you going to take away from what I'm already doing? And on Beacon Hill, my message is, it's yes and. And we can't set this up as a competition between other modes of developing housing. We really want to talk about, in my mind, capitalizing these revolving loan funds and enabling our public institutions to build this mixed income, publicly owned housing. Another important question is, how does this relate to public redevelopment of public housing? And we have an incredible stock of state-owned public housing in our state. It needs many billions of dollars worth of reinvestment and an upgrade. And I think creating these revolving loan funds can actually complement the redevelopment and the reinvestment in our public housing. We can renovate it not just by going out to private equity actors and taking loans at very high interest rates, but drawing upon the affordable financing from a social housing revolving loan fund and using that to complement other efforts to reinvigorate our public housing stock. There's questions around what are the requirements to receiving these funds. There's questions around, do we even want to promote market rate housing? And many of my friends on the left will look at what's happening at Montgomery County, Maryland, and they'll be a little skeptical and say, wait a minute, is there a public subsidy here going to market rate housing? Why would we want to do that when we have a desperate need for affordable housing? Personally, I think there's a strong case to be made, and that's because when the building comes online, even if the affordability doesn't look all that different than other modes of housing production, there's the dimension of time, and there's the opportunity not just to recover the investment that goes out from the revolving fund, but there's the opportunity to maintain that asset. And I think this is something that we really have to think about in government and get away from the mindset that says when we have an asset, we just want to get rid of it. And I think there's so much opportunity to go in that direction. And, you know, finally, I think I'm coming up on the end of time here. There's questions around who will maintain these buildings. You know, when I talk to some of my colleagues on Beacon Hill, they will point to some of the struggles of different aspects of public housing, and they'll say, why would we want to do that again? And again, I think we can structure these deals and we can structure these projects in a way where we can build in the capacity to maintain the housing over time. One of the big advantages of this social housing is if you have mixed income, if it's not just for poor folks like me growing up back in Norwood, if you have a range of incomes, then you'll have a balance sheet that can be more favorable, and you can structure it in a way where you can do the upkeep over time. So, you know, I think, you know, in conclusion, you know, why social housing? I would say we're in an ongoing affordable housing emergency, and we don't have the tools at our disposal to get out of it. Even if we did everything that has conventionally been on the table, we don't have the path to get to where Chris said, where we're housing everyone and where we're actually lowering the cost of housing. I see the social housing model as really a way to go and do that, but I think the question now is, again, how do we take the concept and how do we fit it into our institutional structure? And that's something I'm looking forward to hearing from all the panelists, and looking forward to hopefully inviting all of you to work with me and work with all of us on Beacon Hill to move this pilot program forward, to demonstrate that it's a success, and then make it bigger and make social housing a thing in Massachusetts. So thank you for having me.